Part of having a really great culture in business is giving people in certain endeavors the freedom to try and fail.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories.
So here's my story. I was really taken with the fact that I believe it was yesterday, at the time of this recording anyway, that Ravens training camp opened. And what that really means is that all the veterans reported. And so you had the whole team there, and it's training camp. This is really the first day of training camp, which means they have a new playbook and they have a lot of new personnel and even some new coaches, but yeah, everything is new. That's why they call it training camp, because they don't start the season right then. People, I'm sure, are still introducing each other, themselves. And what fascinates me about this is that because it's the first day of training camp in a national sport, fans are there, paying fans, and the media is there. And I started thinking about, what if the first time I tried something, I don't know, riding a bike, playing piano, whatever it happened to be.
Right.
I had an audience there. Not only an audience just to watch the first time I tried to work on something, but an audience that was then going to write publicly about their opinions.
Right.
Giving their opinions on
take
how
pictures and
how
post
well
it to social media.
Pictures. And so they're like, oh, Elliot really wasn't all that impressive in that first attempt to ride the bike. It seemed like he was pretty unfamiliar with the process. I'm like, yeah, because it's training camp.
Right, right.
And I'm not saying that these people obviously have never played football before.
Right, because they played a lot there NFL level, so it's not that. But
you write things like, or you see articles like, boy, the receiver and the quarterback really did not seem to be on the same page. No, they probably weren't. It's the first day of training camp. So we've talked a number of times about how I think, anyway, and I think we're in agreement on this, that part of having a really great culture in business is giving people in certain endeavors the freedom to try and fail and to learn and evolve. And obviously there are limits. You don't want to do that in neurosurgery, but
although you have to do that. But
that's why they have autopsies the cadavers to practice on.
Sure.
But either way, I was just fascinated by the prospect that failure, which is even within the scope of a company, is something where you want to try and you give yourself the freedom to fail, and what the effect is when it's just public the first time you go out there.
Yeah.
And how that alters your experience and the final product.
Well, it does bring up this very distinct thing of you want to kind of practice quietly in public. Practice quietly in private.
Yeah.
Before, but I think it's such a natural want, but I think there's such a big risk there of getting stuck in that getting ready to be ready kind of place. But I say that, but I remember when I took my facilitation training first, and through that facilitation training, I learned about coaching, which I didn't even know existed. And then I went and did a coaching program. But after the fact, after I'd done both of those things, I jumped right into doing very minor coaching, some of it for free, some of it for a couple of handfuls of dollars or whatever. But that was the thing I could quietly play around. It didn't have to be perfect. I was doing it for free or next to nothing. And so I had that private space to practice and kind of find my own but whatever.
You can't facilitate in private though.
No. And I really did have this, and I don't know how much of it was just, being 15, 20 years younger and not having as much confidence. I don't know if I did that training now, if I would just go try and facilitate with a little bit more ease. But I did have this sort of panic, almost like, oh, well, I guess I'm not going to use that. I mean, it really did feel quite finite because there's not even a practice version of not only do you have to have all the people there, but you're not going to have them facilitate you're not going to facilitate a fake conversation. Like if you have, and I was so conscious of people's time, you get 6, 8, 10, 12 people in a room. That's a lot of man hours that are, that you are responsible for navigating forward. And so practicing that, which of course I had to practice to get better at it, but practicing that felt really daunting.
Well, but that's the other thing is that you can't, this is outside looking in, but I would think it would be difficult for you to get better if your facilitation was not for something that mattered, meaning you're not going to facilitate a 4-hour conference on chocolate versus strawberry. Right. Well,
I don't even know why we have to discuss that, but
but so I guess what I'm fascinated by, and with what you said especially, is, all right, well, how do you practice, especially things where you need other people, and find a low stakes, or a lower stakes environment that still matters enough so that you can evolve.
It's really funny you brought this up, and I didn't think of this when you first started talking, because I was thinking of it in terms of practicing. But I just had a conversation in this past week with someone who was actually someone who's incredibly well established, but is, for whatever reasons, probably internal reasons, but it doesn't matter, is just feeling this lack of confidence, a lack of surety, like known, and everyone else. It's kind of like, any kind of lack of confidence or any kind of self-esteem thing or anxiety or whatever, what does not help is anyone saying it's fine or you're great. Like it doesn't land. It doesn't matter. And what I ended up talking about with this client was exactly what you just said, because my hunch was, I said, you're not going to believe it and digest it and take it in and really own it until you experience it. I don't think there is any words from any human that is going to rise the level of you feeling the way you're hoping to feel more of. I said, I think you just need to be out there and doing stuff. And he was like, yeah, but that's the whole point. I don't want to put myself out there in some place where what I will immediately find out is that there's a reason I should feel not confident about this, because I don't know where to enter the water. And I said, perfect. Then let's just find some, I guarantee you this is below your pay grade, kind of like stepping in and advising people so you can feel super smart, really, but also bored because it's inconsequential. It's at a level that's just not, I was like, and then find ways to amp it up from there until you start feeling the burn. It's almost like starting with the lower weights. You do a warm-up set on a lower weight that just kind of gets your body ready for the thing, but it's not immediately trying to tax it and see what it can do.
So there are a couple of things that come to mind. One is stand-up comedy. Because if you've ever seen, of course,
what?
But if you've ever seen Jerry Seinfeld's comedians in cars getting coffee, which is wonderful. It's a great series. But he talks to successful people in show business, usually, but not exclusively comedians. And they start talking about how they started out. And generally, it's doing stand-up in dives, and they were awful.
Sure.
But it was the kind of places where you don't have a lot of media reporting on, the young Jerry Seinfeld came up and he was heckled and awful. But the only way to get better at their craft was to constantly put themselves in a stressful situation, even if it's a low stakes environment. And I was fascinated by that. And they would say they go to, they did 7 shows in a weekend, some at 2 a.m. before 4 people, including the bartender. Mm-hmm. And so finding the lower stakes environment that still matters, in which you can practice, I think is important because, when I started this, when I saw the news article and thought, I really wanted to talk to you about it. I was thinking, wouldn't it be great if they could do their practices just in private?
Right.
But now I'm starting to think, well, no, that, maybe you don't want your first practice, if you had your choice, plastered all over the major media in your market. But there is some value to having some public, but in a lower stakes environment. So people can say that didn't look right. You seemed out of sorts. You guys weren't communicating, whatever it was. And I'm interested with how you can find that in different businesses.
Yeah, I mean, I a couple things. So this would be a great time to point out, if you haven't joined the Facebook group or the texting platform, which you can join by texting 410-632-6894, or you can find the Facebook group or that texting platform via our website at sohere'smystory.com. We are, as encouragement, as if our loving requests aren't enough encouragement to join in there and chime in on this conversation that we're having right now. Between now and our shared birthday of September 1st, every single week we're giving away a Starbucks gift card. And I'll just mention that this week's winner is Scott Athend, who's one of our very first members. So I was so happy when I pulled his name out of the hat this morning. So join either one of those and you'll be entered for that drawing. But back to your question, I would love to hear from folks, like how, were you able to find entry-level ways to practice your thing quietly? And then I think there's another piece to this. It feels like there are up-leveled games to this whole conversation, and a real key is discerning when you've graduated, you need to graduate from one to the other, because practicing quietly, practicing in small places is great, but then upping your game, I think then is when you have to be up against this thing that I think no one has nailed as fantastically as this short little Ira Glass video that I will find. But he's so great because it says something about, like, nobody tells people who are just beginning a thing that there's going to be really crappy work in the beginning, and you just have to be okay with that. And he brings up something so important, which he says, the problem is that when you start a thing, you go into that thing because you have a high level of taste in that thing. You know what good is, and the gap between what you want it to be and what it really is, you are super aware of the suck. That like, I want it to be this, and here's where it is. And he's got this wonderful thing about, like, sort of playing through that gap and just knowing that that is how it's going to be, because that's sort of that next step to get, otherwise you'll just hang out in quiet, hiding practice places forever. But one of the ways I have gotten over some of those things was finding, either for myself or frankly, like with my kids and stuff, finding ways to do things in tandem. Like, now a thing I know, if I thought of it 20 years ago, is maybe I could have found a facilitator that I could go co-facilitate with. Even if I didn't participate in the first ones, if I was just helping pass out the papers and take notes and whatnot, I could be thinking like, oh, here's how I would have handled that. And then that person did something like, oh, that's way better. That would have gone down a rabbit hole. Or like, oh gosh, I didn't think about that obstacle that might come up. And I would just get to see more real live facility. I mean, because that was the other thing in that particular circumstance. I'd never seen facilitated conversations. Like, I didn't even know what good ones looked like. I'd only had practiced ones in the classes I was taking.
Well, you know what that reminds me of? It's funny that you bring this up, because I had done, as we've talked about, I've done a lot of public speaking, but a lot of the public speaking that I had done, certainly up to a number of years ago, was in the form of my making a presentation to the audience. So there, I had to be informative and entertaining and all that stuff, but it was really a one-way communication, and I was asked by a client several years ago to do a workshop for their management team. And it was still in my area, contract negotiation and all that stuff. But a workshop, as you well know, is markedly different, because there's a lot more back and forth, and it's much more interactive, and it's a smaller group than, 85 people in a room that to whom you're just speaking. And so my first reaction, as you well know, was I called you and I was like, hey, do you want to co-present? And you're like, sure. So we went out, if you remember, we went out and we put on this workshop, and I knew the content that I wanted to present. I knew what I thought this team needed to know about negotiation and, in their area. Mm-hmm. But what I really wanted to see was how you interacted in the exercise and what you brought to prepare for a workshop, because that kind of environment was a lot different than what I had done. So your comment about doing it in tandem just brought that to mind, because it's like, yeah, that's right. That's,
And I learned some of that doing it in tandem with, like, some of the first workshops I did were with another person, Susan Olson, and I did some together. And it wasn't even that she was a lot more versed than I was. It was that we were figuring it out together, and there's just a little bit of safety in numbers, and you're not all on your own. So if something is going a little bit sideways and you're not sure what to do, you're not the only person who might come up with a solution in the moment of how to fix it. And I think there's a lot of that I know when I was at the architecture firm, we would, with great intention, start bringing people to marketing interviews, interviews for jobs, long before there was any reason that the client needed them to be there. We would make up a reason for them to be there so that they could start. We didn't want their first, our jobs on the line marketing presentation to be the first time they'd ever gone and seen. So we started exposing them to those things earlier and giving them little bits that is theirs to do so that you can get their feet wet. And to me, when I was talking to this client that I mentioned a little bit ago, I kept having this image of, there was a wave pool in my town. And that way that, like, in wave pools, you walk in and literally the water starts at nothing. Like, there's a dry part, not completely dry, and then the first little bit of water is nothing. Like it's like a quarter of an inch deep. And then it gets just progressively deeper until it's out in the deep end. And while there's plenty of parts in life where just jumping in the deep end is the way to go, I think there are times where it is perfectly acceptable, as long as you keep moving forward, to find ways to start and just get your feet wet, and then your ankles, and then your knees, so that you have, like, a little bit more, you can build that confidence, but building confidence through action, not through words or reading a book or even any kind of introspection. I think that confidence can only come through actual action.
Yeah, it's funny. I had coffee with my friend Rob Weinhold from Falston Group, and he does crisis PR. And so one of the things that he was talking about, and I was begging him to start this up again, is his whole thing is you have to be ready to meet the moment. So if something dramatic happens in your business and you've got a group of reporters outside your conference room, you don't get to practice for the first time in front of the lights. So he used to hold this event, and he had local news anchors and all that stuff, but he would do a presentation. It was like at a hotel, I think it was the Four Seasons. He'd do presentations and teach them. And then this group, his attendees, would go up the escalator to where they were supposedly going into another conference room. And each one of them was ambushed by a reporter, on whatever scenario it was. And then whatever they said, they were recorded, and then their own responses were dissected. What did you do? How did you react? How did you look? What did you say?
Right.
All of that. So I guess there are two. One is, I think that finding low stakes environments in which you can progress, challenging but low stakes, is something that a lot of businesses don't pay enough attention to. Mm-hmm. Looking for the opportunities to do things in tandem so you can level up your game. Mm-hmm. And then looking at the training that you can get if, quiet is not an option.
What do you mean? If there's no way to practice?
Yeah. If you're going to be the face of your organization and you're not sure how you'd react, that's where you have to seek out some opportunity where you can actually practice crisis,
Yeah. Well, and I think there's also, at that level of things, that's where the part of the culture where it really has to be okay to fail. And that is not fail, but just know that it's not always going to go extremely well. I mean, because I think there are some lessons you can only learn the hard way. And it being okay to know that, like, well, sometimes you're going to learn lessons the hard way and it's really going to stink. And immediately I can think of 3 things that I learned the hard way earlier in my company. One, I learned from watching someone else make a terrible mistake. And I will tell you, I never made that mistake after that, because the things that went into it made perfect sense. But the repercussions of those choices were so huge that I was like, oh, I know not like what to prioritize. in that case and not prioritize those other things that seemed important. But there were, the very first time I ever, speaking of PR stuff, the very first time I ever got asked to do kind of like an interview with the Sun paper, it was about like business and babies or something like that, like having children and running a business and all that stuff. And we had done the interview and we were just about over, ready to hang up. And my little puppy was barking and she said, "Oh, is that a dog? I love dogs." And I said, "Yeah." I said, "We were absolutely insane. We got this puppy 2 weeks before our first child was born. And so now I have a 6-month-old baby and a 6-month-old puppy or 7-month-old puppy. And I don't know what I was thinking. That was crazy." I said, in my first few weeks of having an infant, the last thing you need when you're trying to learn how to breastfeed and change diapers and all that stuff is to turn around and there be poop all over the floor, talking about my dog, of course. And we're like done with the interview. I'm just blathering, whatever. So on Sunday, I go to the church we were attending at the time. And on the bulletin board is they had cut out from the Sunday paper, this thing, because if someone's in the news, they put it up on the bulletin board or whatever. Here's this bulletin board of me. I see my picture. I see the article, but the giant pull quote with the headline around like what it's like to have a business and babies or whatever. No mention of dogs in the article. The giant pull quote, the only thing your eye goes to, I'd be trying to work and I'd turn around and there's poop on the floor. And I was like, oh my God, she made it sound like my kids are just like going to the bathroom on the floor all the time. And there was no context to it whatsoever. And I was like, okay, that's one way to learn a lesson.
I do remember learning the lesson about, quotes in the paper. But, one thing that I was thinking of in terms of the low stakes way to do it, as opposed to media that's going to blast everything all over, is, and this, I know how this is going to sound, so I'll be
but you're going to say it anyway,
which is, certain volunteering opportunities, or in my world, it's pro bono or low bono opportunities where, the matters are still obviously very important to the clients you're representing, but it's a way to dip a toe in certain waters.
Interesting.
And so you can practice. Like one of my friends had recommended this site. He found himself, he wanted to kind of burnish his leadership and facilitation skills. So he started working to mentor a group of what they call micro entrepreneurs in Kenya. I was like, well, how did you get to them? And there's a UN sponsored organization, and it's onlinevolunteering.org. And I went to it, and it's got all of these things all over the world for pro bono or for, they might have some paid, but I think it's mostly pro bono opportunities in everything from leadership to SEO to chemical engineering. And you have to avoid the trap of just doing what you regularly do, but now doing it for free. Right. But one of the things that they try to get people to participate with is by saying that you can stretch your skills. Mm-hmm. You can start to work with obviously different cultures and different mindsets and different geographies and things like that. But it's also a way to look for an opportunity to stretch your skills that may not be immediately apparent in your environment.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. Or even, just even the most obvious thing there is working with other cultures. Yes. there was it didn't end up panning out, but there was a period I was approached about a thing that was going to end up being a more involved thing in a very different culture. And I was nervous about it just because I'm conscious of that. I just simply haven't done that. And I don't know what I don't know about what's considered rude or just those like really subtle things that if you haven't had a lot of experience, you just don't even know what you don't know. And so that kind of thing where you could sort of dabble a little bit, get your feet a tiny bit wet, maybe work out some of the worst kinks. Obviously, I like that you said stretch your skill set. Like, I'm not going to go on there and give law advice for
right. I'm not going to say, okay, this is really the best way to do an appendectomy.
Right. But stretching it. No, I think all of those are fantastic, and it's interesting that finding, because what's at stake here and why I really like this conversation is if you don't find ways to move it forward, then what's at risk is just staying stuck exactly where you are. You know, if you wouldn't be on an NFL team because you didn't like the idea that someone was going to be there on your first day of practice, like that would be, it almost seems ridiculous. I mean, it's almost a ridiculous example. No one would ever put that at stake. But I don't know that it's as obviously ridiculous when we hesitate to do certain things, when there's not that easy way to practice quietly and to get better at a thing before you have to go out.
No,
and
I think that's right. I think that the price that you pay to satisfy the absolute need to get better is the risk of embarrassment, at least at some level.
Well, you know, I feel like I'm at risk at that all day, every day. So maybe I'm just getting used to it.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
Your stories.
You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best
Lovingly
of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us. Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.